So with that introduction, Bill, I will turn it over to you.
Well, thank you for the very nice introduction, and it's great to be back with my people from so long ago. I just want to affirm my support for the work that you do at the HPD Collaborative. I know it is tough to scale these things, but the HPD is an essential disclosure tool that I think will become even more so as we watch ESG criteria evolve to include more impacts on biodiversity and chemical use. We are going to need a good reporting tool for that because the EPD format will prove inadequate. So very big fan of what you all continue to do. I'm going to share some of the work I've been doing over the past 3 years, starting with introducing you to the Chemistry Impact Fund. This is an initiative where we combine funds raised from philanthropy and corporate donors or leaders in the search for safer chemistry. We're led by an advisory board drawn from those corporate donors that currently includes representatives from Apple, Patagonia, Lululemon, and Google. We do this work to advance science-based, data-driven solutions that will systematically eliminate hazardous chemicals and replace them with verified, safer alternatives, critically at scale. We are really looking for opportunities to model, demonstrate, and improve upon systems change. The goal is to mobilize a networked ecosystem of organizations and to embed the metrics and tools that advance safer and sustainable chemistry as the standard operating procedure in supply chains. I would like to emphasize the ecosystem we work with, because although we spend most of our time finding ways to engage with manufacturers in their supply chains, we are also trying to align the efforts of other stakeholders, including investors, regulators, and advocacy groups. I'll mention a little bit about that as we progress in the presentation. We are convinced that we can address what we call the triple threat. Hazardous chemicals are a problem in the environment and for human health. We think it's consistent with transitioning to a lower carbon economy and protecting biodiversity. When we are advocating for safer chemistry, we are bearing all of those outcomes in mind. Safer chemistry isn't an either or, it's an additional strategy to achieve the overall goal of sustainability in business. To that end, we have learned a lot and applied lessons that have been successful in reducing carbon emissions. This starts with the old adage that you can't manage what you can't measure, and there's been great progress in clear and measurable goals that can be scaled from the company level to a country level in reducing carbon emissions. In contrast, many companies, if you look beyond the building industry, have no goals for chemical hazard reduction beyond mere compliance. We set out to help companies set goals they could use in their pursuit of safer chemistry and demystify it. Unlike solar and wind energy, most chemical alternatives have not been tested for safety, leading to the concern about regrettable substitution. And this inhibits companies from making investments. It inhibits advocates from proposing solutions as rather than pointing to problems. It prohibits regulators from finding the right regulatory incentives. We seek to solve that problem by providing a great library of verified safer alternatives. There's a lack of common language on what is safer. We've tried to harmonize the various definitions and settle upon a consistent definition of safer chemistry. And historically, costs have been high, and the transition to safer chemistry slowed by the lack of available information. And to that end, one of our principal investments is in the Chemical Hazard Data Trust, which I'll talk about in a minute. The key components of our fund, what we invest in, are four. First, it starts with the data trust, a shared repository of chemical hazard assessments, along with the quality processes that guide their creation, verification, maintenance, and interpretation. Our goal is to have one analysis per chemical that all stakeholders trust and rely upon, and to make these easily accessible to companies. They do not have to do redundant investigations into chemistry. Over time, we believe this focus on the chemical will operate cross-sector. We also invest in impact programs designed to activate systems change across supply chains. I'll be talking about some of those in this presentation. These are grants we make through an annual RFP process, which often involves both companies and NGOs in a collaborative work together. We've created a knowledge hub, science-based data-driven communications that make the case, provide the data, and we hope create inspiration throughout the supply chain through the success stories we publish. As I mentioned earlier, we have created metrics that can set goals and guide companies and all stakeholders to accelerate the pace of change. You've seen this slide before. Stacy Glass from Chem Forward addressed you last year, so I didn't want to use too many of the same slides that she used. To locate where we're working, HPD operates at the baseline of transparency, which is the cornerstone for safe chemistry. We live in a society where we're screening products. We have RSLs or regulations prohibiting the use of certain chemicals, and we rely on those to make our choices. What's missing is enough information on what remains in the product or was added as an alternative to the chemicals that have been targeted. These are the processes we promote to better understand what chemicals are in our products and how we can be sure they are safe. When we think about supply chain transformation for our investments, we have 5 factors we consider. Product lines are often the easiest to engage because customers and brands are interested in reassuring their customers about the safety of their products. We look for the potential to address disproportionate impacts beyond the immediate customer base of a product, looking at the production facilities, for example. It's very helpful if transparency and disclosure is high, obviously, but that is only one factor we consider. We look for a digital infrastructure to support supply chain information exchange because that is helpful in building the scale we want. But the final factor, the most important factor, is a coalition of respected industry groups or collaborations willing to pioneer this effort in their sector. That helps overcome some of the transparency challenges. If there's weight on any factor, it's looking for the coalition of willing companies. I'm going to talk about some of the work we've done. We've only been in existence for a couple of years, but we've begun to get our first impact reports in terms of measuring year-over-year progress in some of the sectors we work in. We released our first report on defining the metrics by which we evaluate progress in August of 2024. To go through that briefly, we looked at 6 basic metrics. First was how we measured the number of programs using the data trust, accessing the data in that repository of information. Can we reduce the cost of producing chemical hazard assessment and the time it takes to do so? Second, can we measure an increase in the percentage of chemicals that are characterized in a given sector? And with steady progress in that, show the ability to measure year-over-year success and inspire companies in other sectors to try the same thing. A third metric is on identifying alternatives, and we measure that by the number of chemical hazard assessments performed, increasing that number year over year. Another measure is the number of collaboratives we can create. How many sectors of industry have we been able to engage in this effort? The number of calls for alternatives development that we're able to generate. You'll see that in many cases, we're defining a pathway where laggards in the field or companies that have not invested in safer chemistry so far can follow a path blazed by leaders in the field to identifying safer chemistry and improve the overall sector. In some cases, we recognize that there are difficult to replace functions. There we need to create collaborative calls for innovation or green chemistry. It is publicizing the success stories of companies engaged in this process, which I'm going to do a little bit today. This approach was inspired by one of the first collaboratives in electronics that was ongoing before we started the fund, but gave us the inspiration that this was something we could achieve. These companies, with seed funding from Apple and Google, demonstrated it was possible to characterize 95% of the cleaners and degreaser chemicals they were using. And so what these colors mean is the red to green spectrum of high hazard chemicals to safer chemicals. Call your attention to the gray area. Those are the uncharacterized chemicals being used for which we do not have reliable chemical hazard data. That percentage has been shrinking dramatically in this sector. The purple sector are chemical hazard assessments that are currently underway. Another thing that you're going to see throughout the different sectors is that when you do this characterization, you find that there's a lot of good news. This becomes a way for companies and sectors such as beauty and personal care products to demonstrate the success of their efforts by noting that well over 50% of the chemicals in use are characterized as safer on the red to green scale. Last October, we released a report with ChemForward looking at the state of the beauty and personal care products industry. In that report, we were able to aggregate data each company had accumulated by employing ChemForward to conduct an ingredients intelligence report. This is important because it illustrates the scalability of this approach. Each company was able to get a report for how many of their chemicals, what percent of the chemicals used in a certain array of products were characterized. In this case, when they aggregated their data, 70% of the chemicals were well characterized, a 30% gap on the unknowns. One of the big learnings of this initial effort was that this problem is manageable. They started by looking at 8,500 products, which contained over 300,000 ingredients. When they deduplicated those ingredients, they came down to just over 2,200 unique ingredients. That data set changes the narrative, first of all, that we're all very familiar with we have 80,000 or 100,000 chemicals in commerce. Most of them haven't been analyzed for their human health impacts. That seems overwhelming. This seems manageable sector by sector. The experts in their own field then began to accumulate knowledge on how to be smart about identifying targets for improvement, and we get increased efficiencies there. So that was the first good news of last year. Next week, giving you a sneak peek of embargoed information. I believe it's going to get significant press coverage because we were able to look at the data set from 2024 and the beauty and personal care industry and come up with some really encouraging findings. First, the number of products analyzed jumped to over 48,000. ChemForward was able to work on a much higher scale, and that produced a huge increase in the number of ingredients disclosed, moving from that initial data set of 300,000 up to over 1 million. And we found a measurable increase in the unique ingredients, but not a very huge increase, all encouraging signs of working at scale. And then to summarize some of the progress year over year, in terms of the characterization, 69% of chemicals were characterized in the 2023 data set. Next week, we'll reveal that nudged up to 76% in the 2024 data. The presence of verified safer chemistry also notched up a bit from 65% to 71%. And the presence of chemicals of concern also notched up. Well, why do we consider this a success? One reason for the increase in chemicals of concern is the change in the classification of certain chemicals by the EU, and that did move some chemicals that had been C's to the D or F category. But principally, this slight increase came from closing that data gap. As we closed that data gap, some of the chemicals that were analyzed turned out to be very toxic. As you know, you can't manage what you can't measure. Now we're able to measure that and identify whether in a particular use case, those chemicals could be replaced by existing alternatives, or whether that clarifies the focus on the need for a green chemistry innovation industry-wide. Another really interesting piece of the data coming out next week is that we invested approximately as much money in doing chemical hazard assessments and did approximately the same number of assessments as last year. But this year, we're able to close many more data gaps, thereby drawing the cost of closing those data gaps down dramatically for companies. For companies working in this collaborative format, they're now able to close the data gaps in a variety of products for approximately $1 per ingredient. The $6 cost last year was already a reduction from the baseline in years past. In May, we released our second report from the fund in which we were talking to the investment community. I mentioned that we're trying to cultivate alignment of all stakeholders, and there is active work in the investment community to identify ESG criteria that advance goals in protecting biodiversity. And there's our efforts afoot to account for chemical toxicity as part of that process through its health metric. We analyzed the current information that investors receive relative to chemical hazards and made the case that these metrics would produce more actionable information for them. And by adopting them, they would be reinforcing the work that's already going on in some of these sectors. We think it's important that they align their metrics with what's happening in the companies. In August, an organization called the Investors Environmental Health Network issued its recommendation for consumer-facing brands. These are investors who actively participate in shareholder actions. They included ChemForward and the Safer Chemistry Impact Fund as resources. The recommendations they made were fully consistent with our metrics, conducting full chemical hazard inventories, adopting hazard-based chemical management policies and time-bound goals, investing in safer alternatives. I can't share the sneak peek of this report that's coming out in November 25 because they don't have permission to do so. This was an NGO called Planet Tracker based in London, and they took a look at toxic additives in plastics. And using AI, this is a case where we do not have very good transparency, but by using AI and careful searching of chemical sales databases, they were able to produce advice to investors identifying portfolio risk as the number of chemicals in a supply chain that are either unidentified or uncharacterized. I think we'll see more of this coming forward from various NGOs as they try to force more disclosure and progress towards safer chemistry. Our goal is that these efforts are smarter, aligned with what's happening in industry, and point in the same direction that we know industry can go and don't distract from the efforts to identify safer chemistry. Finally, this is Toxic Free Futures Retailer Report Card, issued periodically evaluating retailers based on their chemicals policies. In 2024, they added a fifth category focused on the investment companies make in seeking safer solutions. For the first time, even though a company may have a number of chemical hazards listed in their inventory that they haven't been able to avoid, they can earn credit for the process. Participating in ChemForward is one process that would get this credit. I consider this an important innovation in the advocacy field of focusing on solutions as opposed to only punishing problems. Final milestone, at the end of this year, we will seat the first multi-stakeholder steering committee for the Data Trust. This is rolling out the chemical hazard repository that ChemForward has built and putting it in a process that will be managed by stakeholders as a means of ensuring that this data endures and remains widely accessible. And with that, I'll wrap up. I have talked with Wendy about the possibility of HPDC convening a coalition, building on the transparency disclosure work that you've done to see if we could start a building product cohort. I remain really open and excited about the possibility of doing that.